It began with a silence so thick you could almost hear it hum. No royal fanfare, no gilded pageantry, no charming waves from a palace balcony. Instead, the grand hall of Buckingham Palace was filled with an uneasy stillness, punctuated only by the low click of camera shutters and the occasional shuffle of a journalist's shoes on polished marble. At the center of it all stood two men, brothers, as the world had believed for nearly 4 decades, Prince William and Prince Harry. But that belief was about to be torn apart in front of the eyes of millions. The royal family had never faced anything like this in modern memory. Scandals had come and gone. Affairs, divorces, financial missteps, whispered betrayals. But this was different. This wasn't about tabloid rumors that could be waved away as speculation. This was about proof. Cold, scientific, undeniable proof. And it was about blood, the very thing upon which the monarchy builds its claim to power and legitimacy. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. For years, whispers had slithered through palace corridors and onto the pages of British tabloids. Was Harry really the biological son of King Charles? The rumors were vicious and persistent, pointing fingers toward a man from Diana's past, someone whose striking resemblance to the younger prince had become a favorite talking point among conspiracy-minded royal watchers. These stories would flare up and fade, dismissed by official statements and drowned out by other news cycles. But they never truly died. And now, the palace was about to confirm or deny them once and for all. William's jaw was set in a way that betrayed both fury and sorrow. Harry, on the other hand, looked oddly still, like a man bracing himself against a storm he could not control. Their eyes didn't meet, not once. Between them stood a simple podium, fitted with a microphone, and beside it, a small folder containing the results that had shattered their lives before the public ever heard a word. The world learned that DNA testing had been conducted quietly, discreetly, in a process so secretive that not even most members of the royal household knew it was happening. The samples, we now know, were collected under layers of security, escorted by trusted aides, tested in a private lab whose location was never disclosed, and sealed with official stamps. But secrecy has its limits. Someone had insisted that the truth be made public, and the pressure had been building for weeks. That someone, as insiders would later suggest, wasn't just a tabloid editor or a royal critic. It might have been a royal family member themselves. The announcement came like a blade cutting through history. Prince Harry and Prince William, it turned out, were not full brothers. They shared the same mother, but not the same father. The DNA results had spoken with clinical precision, stripping away decades of royal myth in a matter of seconds. In that moment, the fairy tale image of Diana's 2 sons, forever bonded by blood and tragedy, was fractured into something far more complicated. It is impossible to understand the weight of that revelation without understanding the stakes. For the monarchy, lineage is not just a personal matter. It is the foundation of its authority. If a prince is not the biological son of the monarch, what does that mean for his titles, his place in the line of succession, his entire identity within the royal framework? And beyond the legal implications, there is the human wound. How do you look at the man you grew up calling your brother when the world now knows you are, in a technical sense, only half of what you thought you were to each other? For Harry, this revelation was not a shock in the way it might have been for the public. Rumors had chased him for much of his adult life. Classmates at school had taunted him. Strangers on the street had whispered behind his back. Even in interviews, veiled questions would surface, always hinting at the same forbidden topic. He had learned to shrug them off, to insist that he knew who he was, that his mother's love was proof enough of his place in the family. But knowing something in your heart is not the same as having it confirmed or denied by science. For William, the pain was different. He had grown up fiercely protective of his younger brother. He had defended him from the press, from bullies, from political opportunists who wanted to use him as a pawn. The idea that they might not share the same father wasn't just a headline. It was a personal earthquake, shaking the foundation of every shared memory, every inside joke, every moment of brotherhood forged in the shadow of their mother's tragic death. And then there was the unspoken question, why now? Why release these results at all? Why not keep them sealed, buried deep within palace archives where no one could reach them? Some insiders believe the answer lies in the growing fissures within the royal family itself. Fissures widened by Harry's departure from royal duties, his candid interviews, and the public airing of grievances against the institution. There are whispers that someone saw the release of these results as a way to weaken Harry's influence, to strip him of a moral authority he has wielded in recent years. Others suggest that Harry himself might have pushed for the truth to come out, tired of the rumors and ready to face whatever consequences the facts might bring. The palace did not take questions after the announcement. There was no Q&A session, no room for follow-ups. The statement was read, the results confirmed, and the brothers walked out through separate doors. It was a choreographed exit that spoke volumes without a single word being exchanged. The cameras caught it all, the rigid set of William's shoulders, the slight hesitation in Harry's step, the way their hands remained firmly at their sides instead of offering even the smallest gesture of comfort. Outside, the reaction was instantaneous. Social media exploded with theories, memes, shock, and sympathy. News outlets scrambled to update their headlines. Royal experts were booked on every network, offering conflicting takes on what this meant for the monarchy, for public trust, and for the brothers' personal relationship. Crowds gathered outside palace gates, some in stunned silence, others shouting support or condemnation. The air was thick with questions, but the answers were in short supply. And while the world processed the news, the palace walls were already shifting behind the scenes. Advisors huddled in urgent meetings. Legal experts reviewed constitutional documents. Old letters and diaries, some belonging to Diana herself, were being quietly revisited for context. The family had no choice but to brace for what was coming next, a storm that would test their resilience, their unity, and their ability to control the narrative in an era where control is slipping through their fingers. But beyond the political and public relations fallout, there is the human story. Two boys who once clung to each other in grief now find themselves standing on opposite sides of a truth neither of them can change. For William, it is the loss of an unshakable bond. For Harry, it is the confirmation of a lifelong suspicion, and perhaps a strange kind of freedom. The days ahead would bring more revelations, more speculation, and more fractures in the royal image. But in that moment, in that hall, with the cameras capturing every flicker of emotion, the world witnessed something rare, the unraveling of a story it thought it knew. And so we begin this journey. Not just into the DNA results themselves, but into the decades of history, secrecy, and choices that led to this point. We will explore the whispers that refused to die, the relationships that shaped Diana's final years, the man who may have given Harry his bloodline, and the reasons the palace finally let the truth see daylight. Because behind every headline is a story, and this story is about more than royal scandal. It is about identity, loyalty, and the fragile threads that hold a family together until they break. The announcement was scheduled for precisely 11 a.m., but the world had been holding its breath long before the clock struck the hour. News outlets had been teasing a historic royal statement for days, and the speculation had reached a fever pitch. Commentators spoke in hushed tones, as though even their voices could disturb whatever fragile reality the palace was about to unveil. From London to Los Angeles, televisions were tuned in, live streams were counting down in the corner of screens, and millions sat poised to witness history. Inside Buckingham Palace, the atmosphere was something close to electric paralysis. The grand ballroom, where countless state banquets and coronations had once been celebrated, had been transformed into a press room. Long rows of chairs faced the dais, their occupants a mixture of journalists, photographers, and a select few international correspondents chosen for their reach and credibility. Heavy velvet drapes had been drawn back to let in the pale winter light, which spilled across the polished parquet floor and reflected faintly off the gold leaf moldings. The podium was set slightly off-center, flanked by two simple chairs that were conspicuously empty. A royal coat of arms hung above it, a reminder of the centuries-old institution that had weathered wars, abdications, and scandals, but never anything quite like this. To the side, a small table held a single folder, slender but unassuming, containing the document that had already shaken the lives of the two men about to face the public. A rustle of movement at the back of the room turned heads. Prince William entered first, his face carefully arranged into an expression of impassive control. He wore a dark navy suit, his tie a muted royal blue. Every line of his posture suggested restraint, as though any sudden gesture might betray more than he was willing to share. Behind him, Prince Harry followed, his suit slightly lighter in shade, but his demeanor no less guarded. He kept his gaze forward, avoiding the battery of cameras that whirred and clicked as they stepped into the light. The brothers took their places on either side of the podium. For a brief moment, they looked as if they might glance at each other, but their eyes never met. The absence of even the smallest acknowledgement between them spoke louder than words. The silence was so pronounced that when the first clearing of a throat came from the press gallery, it sounded almost intrusive. A senior palace official, Sir Alastair Pembroke, stepped forward to address the crowd. His voice was steady, but it carried the weight of something irrevocable. He thanked the gathered press for their attendance and made a short acknowledgement of the sensitive nature of the statement. Then, without flourish or hesitation, he opened the folder and began to read. Following recent internal and external inquiries, and with the consent of both His Royal Highness the Prince of Wales and His Royal Highness the Duke of Sussex, DNA testing was conducted to address long-standing questions regarding paternity. The room seemed to inhale as one. Every camera tilted forward, every pen was poised. Sir Alastair's voice did not waver. The results of these tests have concluded, with scientific certainty, that while their Royal Highnesses share the same mother, the late Diana, Princess of Wales, they do not share the same biological father. No gasps escaped the press, perhaps out of professional decorum, but the tension was palpable. Photographers leaned in, desperate to capture the flicker of emotion on each prince's face. William's jaw clenched slightly, his eyes fixed on some invisible point ahead. Harry remained still, though his lips pressed together in a manner that betrayed the effort it took to remain composed. Sir Alastair continued, speaking of respect for privacy, of the brothers' continued commitment to their duties, and the royal family's request for the public to allow them space to process the news. But the statement was already done. The essential truth had been spoken, and it was now rushing across the globe faster than the official words could travel. When Sir Alastair closed the folder and stepped back, there was a pause, short but heavy, before the brothers moved. William inclined his head slightly toward the audience, a formal nod that acknowledged the press without inviting questions. Harry's gaze flickered, just briefly, across the front row before he too gave a curt nod. And then, in perfect symmetry, they turned and walked in opposite directions, William to the right, Harry to the left, vanishing behind separate sets of double doors. The symbolic weight of that exit was not lost on anyone. Two brothers, once inseparable in the public imagination, now literally and metaphorically walking away from each other in the moment that confirmed they were not bound by paternal blood. Outside the palace, the world reacted in real time. Within minutes, every major news outlet had pushed alerts to phones. DNA results confirm William and Harry are half-brothers. Screens in Times Square flashed the news alongside grainy archival images of Diana holding her young sons. In Sydney, breakfast television hosts struggled to keep up with the flood of viewer messages, many expressing shock, others saying they had suspected as much for years. In Nairobi, callers to a popular radio program debated whether the news would change their view of the monarchy at all. In London, clusters of people gathered near Buckingham Palace gates, pressing their faces to the black iron railings in hopes of catching a glimpse of movement inside. Some stood in solemn silence, while others debated heatedly, their voices carrying over the crowd. A small group of supporters held up signs reading, "We stand with Diana's boys," while further down the line, a man shouted that Harry had never looked like Charles in the first place. Inside the palace walls, the shockwaves were no less severe. Senior aides retreated to private meeting rooms, phones pressed to their ears as they fielded calls from political contacts, foreign embassies, and international press. The communications team began drafting follow-up statements, knowing full well that the first announcement had only opened the floodgates. There would be demands for more information about when the testing had taken place, why it had been initiated, and who had authorized its public release. Meanwhile, behind a set of heavy oak doors, William stood with two of his closest advisors. He did not speak for a long time, instead removing his tie and running a hand across his face. He was a man who had weathered many public storms, but this was different. This was personal in a way that no royal scandal had ever been before. One advisor finally broke the silence, asking if he wished to issue a personal statement. William shook his head. Not now. Not yet. Harry, in a separate wing of the palace, sat in a smaller, more intimate room. Meghan was not present. Her location at that moment would become a subject of speculation later, but a trusted friend had joined him. Harry spoke in a low voice, reflecting on how surreal it felt to have the rumors he had lived with for decades finally spoken aloud to the world. He admitted there was a strange relief in it, though it came at the cost of something he could never get back: the illusion that his and William's bond was unshakable. In the hours that followed, the story consumed every news cycle. Analysts dissected every word of the announcement, body language experts weighed in on the brothers' movements, and historians offered context by pointing to other moments in royal history when legitimacy had been questioned. Some compared the moment to the abdication crisis of 1936. Others argued it was even more consequential in the modern era, given the scrutiny of a 24-hour news cycle and the reach of social media. For ordinary people watching at home, the reaction was more visceral. In living rooms and cafes, the conversation turned to the nature of family itself. Was blood truly the defining factor, or did shared experiences and love carry more weight? For some, the answer was clear. Nothing could erase the years William and Harry had spent growing up together, grieving their mother, and navigating the pressures of royal life. For others, the DNA results fundamentally altered the way they saw the monarchy, raising questions about transparency, trust, and the hereditary right to rule. By nightfall, the palace facade was bathed in artificial light, but the mood inside remained shadowed. The day had begun with anticipation and ended with a truth that could not be undone. Whatever came next, whether reconciliation, estrangement, or something in between, would unfold under the unblinking gaze of a world that had just witnessed the unmaking of one of its most enduring images. Two princes, bound not by the accident of birth, but by the story the world had told itself for nearly 40 years. This was no longer just a family matter. It was a moment that would ripple through history, reshaping the way the monarchy was seen, and perhaps even what it would become. The world had stopped for the announcement, but in its aftermath, it was clear nothing would ever be quite the same again. Long before any official announcement, long before a single DNA sample was taken, the whispers had already taken root in the shadows of royal life. These were not the kind of rumors that faded quickly. They were the kind that lived in quiet corners, passed in low tones at dinner parties, and whispered over clinking glasses at charity galas. They did not roar. They lingered. It began almost as soon as Harry could walk. Photographs of the young prince would be printed in glossy magazines, often side by side with images of Charles at the same age. Readers would note the differences: Harry's auburn hair, his freckled complexion, the distinctive set of his jaw. Some chalked it up to Diana's side of the family, pointing to her brother and father for proof. But others, especially the more conspiratorial segments of the press, latched onto the idea that the differences meant something more. By the mid-1990s, a single name had begun surfacing again and again: James Hewitt. A former British Army officer and accomplished horseman, Hewitt had been linked to Diana in stories that alternated between romanticized and scandalous. Photos of the two together, smiling, relaxed, their body language betraying a familiarity, fueled speculation that went far beyond polite conversation. The most salacious outlets hinted outright that Hewitt was Harry's father, and the comparison photographs between him and the young prince became a recurring tabloid feature. The palace, of course, dismissed these claims. Official statements were issued, reminding the public that Harry had been born 2 years before Diana and Hewitt allegedly began their relationship. But the problem with rumors is that they rarely die from official denials. Often, such statements only embolden those determined to believe otherwise. Every time the palace swatted down the story, it seemed to come back stronger, like a weed that refused to be uprooted. In the public sphere, these whispers remained just that, whispers. But within certain social circles, they were treated almost as an open secret. Former staffers from Kensington Palace have since admitted that the talks circulated in hushed tones among junior aides. A footman, speaking anonymously years later, described how one could walk into the staff kitchen and overhear a quiet debate over whether Harry's resemblance to Hewitt was coincidence or something more. The rules of royal service meant no one would ever say such things in front of the family, but behind closed doors, the speculation was alive and well. The press, particularly in Britain's cutthroat tabloid industry, understood the power of the story. It was a ticking time bomb they could revisit whenever circulation numbers dipped or a fresh scandal was needed to dominate headlines. Even after Diana's tragic death, when the public mood shifted toward reverence for her memory, the rumors never completely disappeared. They would resurface every few years, often attached to some new photograph of Harry that seemed, at least to those determined to see it, to prove the theory. For Harry, the effect was insidious. While he grew up shielded from much of the outside world, boarding schools and military service brought him into closer contact with peers who were less restrained in their comments. Former classmates have recounted instances where the question was asked to his face, sometimes as a cruel joke, sometimes with genuine curiosity. Harry would deflect, laugh it off, or shut it down, but the repetition wore at him. It was one thing to hear strangers speculate. It was another to have it thrown at you by people you knew. Diana herself had spoken candidly about her relationship with Hewitt in interviews, admitting they had been close and that the bond had been significant. But she had also firmly maintained that Harry was already born by the time their romantic involvement began. To her, the timeline was simple fact. To others, it was conveniently tidy. Skeptics pointed to the possibility that the nature of their friendship began earlier than Diana admitted, or that the official accounts had been tailored to protect reputations. The whispers were not confined to the UK. Internationally, especially in countries with strong tabloid cultures of their own, the story became a sort of imported scandal. In Australia, television talk shows would occasionally broach the subject during slow news weeks. In the United States, glossy supermarket magazines would print side-by-side photos under headlines that flirted with the truth without outright stating it. In South Africa, where Diana was beloved, local papers often reprinted British stories, sometimes with a sympathetic slant toward Harry as the target of baseless gossip. Then came the internet. By the early 2000s, online forums and gossip blogs took the rumors and amplified them to a global scale. No longer limited by the editorial caution of traditional media, amateur sleuths shared photos, timelines, and their own theories, dissecting every public image of Harry as if it were a crime scene. A single grainy image of Hewitt could circulate for years, continually fueling new debates. Palace insiders say that this persistent undercurrent shaped the way the royal family presented Harry to the public. Photographs of him with Charles became more frequent during official events, as though to visually reinforce the father-son bond. Moments of physical affection between them, rare in the traditionally reserved family, were captured and circulated in official channels. Yet for every smiling image, there were critics who claimed it was nothing more than a carefully orchestrated display. Over the years, the story took on a strange dual life. On one hand, it was a source of gossip entertainment, something to be discussed over morning coffee or shared with a smirk on social media. On the other, it carried deep emotional implications for the people at its center. For William, it was an affront not just to his father, but to the unity of the image he and Harry had cultivated as the inseparable sons of Diana. For Harry, it was a shadow that followed him into adulthood, an unasked question hanging over every public appearance. There were moments when it seemed the rumors might finally be laid to rest. In 2002, Hewitt himself gave an interview reiterating that his relationship with Diana began after Harry's birth. He expressed frustration at being constantly dragged into the theory, saying it was hurtful to all involved. But even his denial, coming directly from the supposed other man, did not end the speculation. For many, the narrative was simply too compelling to abandon. The rumors found new life during Harry's courtship and eventual marriage to Meghan Markle. Some corners of the press, particularly those hostile to the couple, revived the paternity story as a way to question Harry's place within the royal hierarchy. If he were not truly Charles's son, they suggested, his children would be even further removed from the line of succession. It was ugly, calculated, and often tinged with undercurrents of racial hostility toward Meghan. By this point, Harry had developed a habit of confronting uncomfortable narratives head-on. In interviews, he dismissed the rumors as nonsense, but acknowledged the frustration they caused. He spoke of the impact on his mental health, describing how living under constant public scrutiny was like breathing in smog every day. It's there whether you want it or not. His candor won him sympathy from many, but also seemed to embolden those who sensed how deeply the subject affected him. The tipping point, according to several royal correspondents, came in the last 2 years. Private conversations within the palace began to shift from denial to containment. The fact that such rumors had persisted for decades, despite repeated official denials, created a dangerous precedent. If left unchecked, they could undermine the credibility of the monarchy itself. For a family whose entire authority rests on bloodlines, allowing questions of paternity to fester was risky business. And so, without fanfare, the wheels began turning. Quiet inquiries were made. Discreet meetings were held between trusted advisors and scientific consultants. The possibility of DNA testing moved from taboo to necessity, driven less by personal curiosity and more by institutional self-preservation. No one knew exactly how the results would be handled, whether they would be buried in a locked archive or released to the public, but everyone involved understood the stakes. The irony, of course, is that the rumors that had existed in the shadows for decades were not the product of a single event or a single person. They were the accumulation of countless small observations, whispers, and coincidences. A photograph here, a slip of the tongue there, an offhand remark at a social gathering. All of it built into a mythology that became almost impossible to dismantle. And when the truth finally came, it would not be the product of a single revelation, but the result of decades of suspicion meeting the cold precision of science. The shadows that had lingered over Harry's life were about to be illuminated, and the light would reveal more than anyone had prepared for. The decision to conduct a DNA test within the British royal family was not one made lightly, nor was it executed in the open. It began as a whisper between trusted advisors, an idea so sensitive that even speaking it aloud in certain rooms risked political and personal fallout. Yet for all its danger, the thought had been building for years. The rumors about Prince Harry's paternity had reached a point where the royal family could no longer ignore them, not because they believed them, but because the public did. In the beginning, it was a matter of control. Palace strategists understood that in the age of social media and 24-hour news, allowing a decades-old rumor to drift unchecked was akin to leaving a fire smoldering in the rafters of an ancient house. It might never catch fully, but if it did, the blaze could bring down the entire structure. The monarchy's strength was built on perception, on the idea of an unbroken, legitimate bloodline stretching back centuries. Anything that threatened that narrative was a threat to the institution itself. No single person claimed responsibility for initiating the investigation, but those closest to the situation suggest it was the combined effort of two powerful factions within the palace: the communications arm, tasked with defending the family's image, and the legal advisors, tasked with defending its legitimacy. Between them sat the quiet agreement that if the question of Harry's paternity was ever to be put to rest, it could only be done with absolute certainty and absolute secrecy. The first challenge was logistics. A DNA test could not simply be arranged through a public clinic. It required layers of anonymity, specialized scientific expertise, and a chain of custody so secure that no one outside a trusted circle could interfere. The palace reached out, through intermediaries, to one of Europe's most discreet genetic laboratories, an institution with a history of handling high-profile cases for governments, intelligence agencies, and ultra-wealthy private clients. The lab agreed on one condition: the samples would be delivered in person, under direct security, and the results would be sealed until released by the authorized party. Obtaining the samples was a delicate operation. For Prince Harry, consent was the most pressing issue. Palace aides later revealed that Harry was approached in a private meeting, away from cameras, and without the presence of other family members. There, the rationale was laid out plainly. The rumors had grown too persistent, the monarchy's credibility too intertwined with the question. Harry was told that by agreeing to the test, he could put the matter to rest once and for all. Whether he hesitated is still a matter of speculation. Some believe Harry saw it as an opportunity to take control of the narrative after years of taunts and headlines. Others suspect he felt cornered, presented with a request he could hardly refuse without fueling further suspicion. In the end, he agreed, on the condition that the process be handled with absolute transparency between himself and the testing body. William's involvement was different. His paternity had never been in question, but as a control measure, his DNA would be included to establish the comparison. Unlike Harry, William is said to have consented quickly, though sources suggest it was done out of duty rather than personal curiosity. For him, the stakes were about the monarchy's stability, not answering a question he considered settled. The actual collection of the samples took place in two separate, heavily secured locations. For Harry, it was in a private medical facility in California during one of his return visits to the United States. For William, it was in a discreet wing of a London hospital, away from the main public entrances. Both sessions were attended by a palace-appointed medical officer and an independent representative from the laboratory to verify authenticity. The samples, cheek swabs and a small vial of blood from each, were immediately sealed in tamper-proof containers, marked with anonymized codes instead of names. From there, the samples began their journey to the lab. This was no simple courier job. The containers were transported in a secure diplomatic pouch, hand-carried by a trusted official with a security clearance that allowed them to move through airports without customs inspections. At each handover point, signatures were taken, photographs logged, and secure communications sent to confirm the chain of custody. The journey took less than 48 hours from collection to arrival at the laboratory. Once at the facility, the samples were processed with the kind of precision and confidentiality usually reserved for intelligence operations. The genetic markers were analyzed using multiple testing methods to ensure accuracy. A comparison was run between the two brothers, focusing on paternal lineage markers that would indicate whether they shared the same father. While the scientists had no direct access to identifying information, the genetic data told its story clearly. It took less than a week for the initial results to be clear. The brothers' maternal DNA matched perfectly, confirming their shared link to Diana. But on the paternal side, the data revealed a complete mismatch. No shared Y chromosome markers, no indication of the same biological father. The conclusion was inescapable. The lab prepared the final report, a concise document containing the raw data, the analysis, and the unequivocal conclusion. Prince William and Prince Harry were half-brothers. The document was printed in duplicate, sealed in separate envelopes, and dispatched via the same secure channels back to the palace. The moment the results arrived, the atmosphere inside Buckingham Palace shifted. Those who had suspected the outcome were grimly validated. Those who had assumed the test would put the rumors to rest in Harry's favor were left reeling. The family was informed in stages, with only a handful of senior figures seeing the raw report. Harry was briefed privately, away from the palace entirely. Accounts suggest he received the news with a controlled, almost numb expression. It was not, perhaps, a shock in the way it might have been years earlier. After all, the rumors had followed him since childhood. But hearing it confirmed in cold, clinical terms was different. There was no room for doubt now, no space for hopeful denial. William, on the other hand, is said to have reacted with a visible tightening of posture, the kind of reaction one might expect from a soldier receiving bad news in the field. The results didn't just confirm a personal truth, they cracked the public narrative he had carried since his youth. The image of himself and Harry as an unshakable unit, two sons bound by both blood and tragedy, had been a cornerstone of his identity. Now, that image would never be the same. From that point forward, the question was no longer about what the truth was. It was about what to do with it. Some palace advisors urged immediate suppression, arguing that the monarchy had survived far worse and that releasing the results would only invite chaos. Others argued that in an era of leaks and hacks, the truth would emerge whether the palace wanted it to or not, and that controlling the release was the only way to manage the damage. In the weeks that followed, the investigation itself became a guarded secret within the palace. Documents were locked in high-security archives, discussions held in rooms swept for electronic surveillance. Only a tiny handful of people knew the full scope of what had been done, and fewer still had access to the actual results. Even within that circle, there were divisions over the next steps. Meanwhile, life went on in public as though nothing had changed. The brothers attended separate engagements, spoke in polite terms about each other in interviews, and maintained the outward image of royal unity. But those who had been in the room when the results were discussed could see the subtle shifts. The cooler tone in William's voice when speaking of Harry, the more measured and guarded expressions on Harry's face during family appearances. The secrecy could not last forever. In a world where every email could be hacked and every document photographed, the likelihood of a leak was high. The palace communications team began drafting contingency statements, carefully worded responses that could be issued if the information surfaced in the press. But even as they prepared for damage control, one question loomed larger with each passing day. Who, ultimately, would decide whether the truth stayed locked away or whether it was shown to the world? What began as a quiet effort to put rumors to rest had now become a crossroads moment for the monarchy. The DNA test was done, the science was settled, and the truth was in their hands. The question now was not whether William and Harry were full brothers. The question was whether the royal family could survive what would happen when everyone else knew it too. In the days following the private confirmation of the DNA results, the fragile civility between William and Harry began to crack. What had once been an underlying tension, rooted in years of differences in personality, lifestyle, and public duty, quickly began to harden into something far more volatile. Both men had been shaped by the same childhood tragedy. Both had lived under the unrelenting glare of the public eye. But this new truth pushed them into uncharted territory. For William, the revelation struck at the heart of his personal identity as much as it did at the monarchy's public image. He had always been the elder brother, the one destined for the throne, but in his mind that role had never been in opposition to his loyalty to Harry. They had been a team, a unit formed in the shadow of loss. He had carried that bond through decades of growing responsibilities, through royal tours, through their shared battles against the press. Now, every moment of that shared history seemed to come with an asterisk. For Harry, the feeling was equally complicated. The results hadn't so much surprised him as they had confirmed what he had long suspected. But confirmation brought its own burden. It meant that every sideways glance, every offhand comment from strangers, every tabloid headline had been a hint at a truth no one in his family had been willing to say aloud. It was one thing to bear the weight of rumor. It was another to know it was rooted in fact. And now, Harry found himself wondering how many of his relatives had quietly believed it all along. The first real fracture came during a private meeting convened by senior palace advisors. The purpose was to discuss whether, and how, the DNA results might eventually be addressed publicly. William arrived on time, dressed formally, with a thick folder of briefing notes in hand. Harry came late, in more casual attire, his mood already sour from what he described to aides as yet another PR containment exercise. The discussion quickly turned heated. William argued that any public acknowledgement would undermine the stability of the monarchy and bring unnecessary scrutiny not just to them, but to their children. Harry countered that the truth had a way of surfacing whether people wanted it to or not, and that the only way to control the story was to own it before it leaked. At one point, according to a source present in the room, William leaned forward and told Harry that his insistence on transparency was selfish and reckless. Harry shot back that William was clinging to an image of the family that doesn't exist anymore. The exchange ended with both men standing, voices raised, before a senior aide stepped in to diffuse the confrontation. The meeting concluded without a resolution, and the brothers left through different exits without a handshake or a word of parting. In public, their interactions became strained. At official events, they stood farther apart, avoided eye contact, and spoke to each other only in the most perfunctory terms. Body language experts who analyzed footage of the two noted the change. How William's shoulders stiffened in Harry's presence, how Harry's jaw tightened when William addressed him. To the casual observer, these might have seemed like minor details. But to those who had watched the brothers for decades, the shift was unmistakable. Behind the scenes, their separate camps of advisors began to function almost as rival courts. William's team focused on shoring up his image as the steady, reliable heir who could lead the monarchy into the future. Harry's advisors worked to position him as an independent figure, unafraid to speak his truth even when it came at personal cost. These competing narratives began to spill into the press through selective leaks, an unflattering story about Harry in one paper, a subtle dig at William in another. Meghan's presence, too, became a point of contention. Harry confided in her more than anyone else, and she was unflinching in her support for going public with the DNA results. William, however, viewed her as a destabilizing influence who encouraged Harry's defiance of palace traditions. This perception deepened existing resentments between the brothers, making it nearly impossible for them to find common ground. The situation reached another boiling point during a family gathering at Sandringham. The meeting, called by King Charles, was intended to be an opportunity for private discussion away from the glare of the media. But within minutes, the conversation turned to the DNA results. Charles, in his measured way, urged both sons to think of the monarchy's long-term health and avoid actions that might irreparably damage it. Harry, visibly frustrated, asked why it was his responsibility to protect an institution that had never fully protected him. According to multiple sources, William then accused Harry of deliberately seeking to damage the family for personal gain. Harry responded by accusing William of protecting a lie for the sake of appearances. The exchange grew loud enough that aides stationed outside the room could hear the raised voices. By the end of the meeting, Harry had left Sandringham earlier than planned, returning to London without attending the scheduled family dinner. This was the new reality. Two men who had once been each other's confidants now operated like adversaries. Their communication dwindled to the bare minimum required for public appearances, and even then, it was mediated through aides. Each step forward seemed to be followed by 2 steps back. The rift did not go unnoticed by the public. Newspapers began running side-by-side photographs of the brothers from earlier years, laughing together at polo matches, walking shoulder to shoulder at official events. Juxtaposed with recent images of them avoiding eye contact, headlines asked whether their bond could survive, while talk shows speculated on whether the DNA revelation was the final nail in the coffin of their relationship. Inside their respective households, the toll was personal. William was said to be more withdrawn with his closest friends, confiding in only a select few about the depth of his disappointment. Harry, meanwhile, grew increasingly vocal in his private circle about the hypocrisy of maintaining a facade for the public when the truth was already known within the family. The brothers had always had differences, but now those differences were cemented by an unchangeable fact of biology. As the weeks passed, the silence between them became almost as telling as their arguments. Messages went unanswered, invitations ignored. At public events, moments that might once have been opportunities for quiet jokes or supportive glances were replaced with cold nods and quick departures. It was in this atmosphere that palace aides began to worry about the long-term implications, not just for the monarchy's image, but for the possibility of reconciliation. Every passing day seemed to deepen the divide, and with rumors of a possible leak of the DNA results growing louder, the stakes for both brothers were about to rise even higher. The question was no longer whether the two men could work together as brothers. It was whether they could even speak to each other without turning the conversation into a battlefield. And as the palace braced for the possibility of the truth reaching the public, the war between William and Harry showed no signs of ending. To understand the explosive impact of the DNA results, one must first return to the woman at the heart of it all, Diana, Princess of Wales. Her life has been told and retold in biographies, documentaries, and dramatizations, yet even now, there remain chapters the public has only glimpsed in fragments. Diana's story, particularly in the final years of her marriage, is essential to understanding how such a secret could have been born, nurtured, and ultimately exposed. Diana entered royal life as a young woman who, in many ways, was unprepared for the enormity of the role she was stepping into. She was 19 when she became engaged to the then Prince Charles, and although the fairy tale imagery captivated the public, the reality was far more complex. Charles, significantly older and already deeply attached to Camilla Parker Bowles, approached the marriage with a sense of duty rather than romantic devotion. Diana, idealistic and eager to please, found herself navigating a cold and rigid court where emotions were treated as weaknesses. From the beginning, She was adored by the public, but misunderstood by the institution she had married into. Her charisma and natural empathy drew crowds, but behind palace walls, she struggled with loneliness, bulimia, and the pressures of constant scrutiny. In her private tapes, recorded secretly for her biographer Andrew Morton, she would later describe feeling as though she had been thrown to the wolves. By the late 1980s, the cracks in the marriage had become obvious, even to the public. Charles's relationship with Camilla was an open secret among the royal circle, and Diana, though outwardly composed, was deeply wounded by the betrayal. She began seeking emotional connection and validation outside her marriage, often with people who offered her the warmth and attention she was denied at home. It was during this period that she formed close bonds with several men, some platonic, others rumored to be romantic. These relationships provided a lifeline, a reminder that she was more than a royal symbol. Among them was James Hewitt, the man whose name would later become synonymous with the paternity rumors surrounding Harry. Hewitt, a charismatic cavalry officer, met Diana in the mid-1980s through a mutual friend. He was tasked with giving her riding lessons, and the shared time in the quiet countryside quickly blossomed into a friendship. Hewitt's easy manner and genuine interest in her life offered a stark contrast to the aloofness she experienced from her husband. Over time, their connection deepened, becoming romantic according to both Hewitt's later accounts and Diana's own admission in interviews. The timeline of their relationship has always been the point of contention. Both parties have insisted it began after Harry's birth in 1984, but skeptics have pointed to inconsistencies in public appearances, travel schedules, and subtle changes in Diana's demeanor. For those inclined to believe the rumors, the similarities in appearance between Hewitt and Harry were all the proof they needed. For those loyal to Diana's version of events, the speculation was a cruel and baseless attack on her integrity. Yet Hewitt was only one chapter in Diana's search for companionship. She was known to have formed close relationships with several other men during and after her marriage, some of which carried their own whiffs of scandal. Each connection seemed to underline the same truth. Diana was a woman starved of affection, living in a gilded cage, and grasping at any opportunity to feel truly seen. In private, she was candid about her struggles. Friends recall her speaking openly about the loneliness of life inside the palace, where her every move was scrutinized and her genuine warmth was often treated as a liability. She was acutely aware of her role as a mother and fiercely protective of her boys, often making choices designed to shield them from the coldness of royal protocol. This protectiveness is what makes the DNA revelations all the more complicated. If Diana did have an affair before Harry's birth, it is entirely possible she would have kept the truth even from her closest allies. Protecting Harry from a lifetime of speculation might have meant carrying that burden alone. But Diana was not simply a victim of her circumstances. She was also a master of shaping her public image, sometimes using the media to her advantage. Her infamous BBC Panorama interview in 1995, in which she declared there were 3 of us in this marriage, was a calculated move that shifted public sympathy firmly to her side. It was an unprecedented act of defiance against the royal family, and it cemented her legacy as the people's princess, while simultaneously deepening the rift with Charles and the institution. That interview, while groundbreaking, also demonstrated Diana's willingness to control the narrative. She could be disarmingly open in some areas while fiercely guarding others. Even those who knew her best admit that there were parts of her life she kept entirely to herself, guarded by a combination of pride, fear, and a desire to protect her children. In her final years, following her divorce from Charles in 1996, Diana's life seemed to be entering a new chapter. She threw herself into humanitarian work, championing causes like landmine clearance and HIV/AIDS awareness. She traveled extensively, appearing more confident and independent than ever. But her personal life remained the subject of intense media interest, with photographers following her every move, particularly in her relationships with high-profile men such as Hasnat Khan, the heart surgeon she reportedly described as the love of her life, and later Dodi Fayed. It was during this period that the paternity rumors about Harry began to resurface with renewed vigor, spurred on by tabloids eager to exploit any angle that could sell papers. Diana, for her part, ignored the speculation publicly, focusing instead on her boys and her work. Privately, she was said to be deeply hurt by the persistence of the gossip, seeing it as an attack not only on her fidelity, but on Harry's dignity. Tragically, Diana's life was cut short in 1997 in a car crash in Paris, leaving behind 2 young sons and a world still grappling with her legacy. In death, as in life, she remained a figure of fascination and controversy. For William and Harry, she became not just their mother but the embodiment of their connection to the public, the bridge between the monarchy and the people. And yet, the DNA results decades later cast a shadow backward, forcing a re-evaluation of moments long past. The image of Diana cradling her newborn Harry in the Lindo wing, beaming for the cameras, now exists alongside a question that will never be definitively answered. What did she know, and what truths did she choose to keep hidden? Those who loved her insist that the answer doesn't matter, that her devotion to Harry was unconditional and her role as his mother was beyond dispute. Others argue that the secrecy, if there was any, was part of a larger pattern of carefully managed truths in her life. In the end, Diana's untold story is not just about potential affairs or whispered rumors. It is about a woman navigating impossible circumstances, making choices in a world where love, duty, and image were constantly at war. The DNA revelation does not erase her impact or her legacy, but it does add a new layer to the narrative. A reminder that even the most beloved figures carry secrets, and that those secrets can echo for decades after they are gone. For William and Harry, the truth about their mother's past is now entwined with their own identities. And as the public revisits Diana's life with this new knowledge, the myth and the reality of the people's princess will continue to evolve, just as the relationship between her 2 sons evolves under the weight of the truth she may have taken to her grave. When the DNA results confirmed that Prince William and Prince Harry did not share the same father, public curiosity turned sharply toward one question. If not King Charles, then who? The speculation was immediate and intense, fueled by decades of whispered names and half-remembered stories from the margins of royal history. Among these names, one in particular surged to the forefront: James Hewitt. Hewitt's connection to Diana had been public knowledge for years, yet in the wake of the DNA revelation, his name took on new weight. For those inclined to believe the long-circulating rumors, the scientific confirmation seemed to all but seal the case. Photographs of Hewitt in his younger years began circulating online once again, juxtaposed against images of Harry at various stages of his life. The similarities, depending on who was looking, were either striking or overstated. The auburn hair, the freckles, the strong jawline. Some saw them as undeniable proof, while others dismissed them as mere coincidence. James Hewitt himself had lived under the shadow of these rumors since the 1990s. He had spoken about his relationship with Diana in interviews, and even in a memoir, but he had consistently maintained that their romance began after Harry's birth in 1984. Still, skepticism lingered. The public knew that Diana had met Hewitt when Harry was still a toddler, and that their relationship had been intense enough for her to confide in him deeply. In private moments captured years later, Diana reportedly spoke warmly of Hewitt's kindness during a period of her life when she felt isolated and unloved. Hewitt's background was in many ways the opposite of the stiff royal mold. Born into a military family, he had a reputation for charm, confidence, and a certain playboy streak. As an accomplished equestrian and cavalry officer, he moved in elite circles, and it was through mutual acquaintances in the equestrian world that he met the Princess of Wales. Their early meetings were said to be friendly, but as Diana's marital troubles deepened, those meetings became more frequent and more personal. One detail that fueled suspicion was the timeline of their interactions. While both Diana and Hewitt claimed their romance began in 1986, skeptics pointed to photographs, travel itineraries, and social calendars that placed them together earlier than that. In the fevered speculation that surrounded the royal family, such inconsistencies were treated as evidence of a cover-up rather than the natural blurring of events over time. Hewitt's life after his relationship with Diana ended was marked by fluctuating fortunes. He left the army, attempted various business ventures, and even appeared in reality television programs. At times, he seemed to court public attention. At others, he retreated from it entirely. Throughout it all, the question of Harry's paternity remained a recurring theme, sometimes resurfacing in tabloid interviews he later regretted giving. In the days following the DNA announcement, reporters sought out Hewitt for comment. He issued a brief statement through a representative, neither confirming nor denying the implication, but reiterating that his relationship with Diana began after Harry's birth. He also expressed a wish for privacy, noting that the matter was deeply personal for all involved. Some interpreted his measured response as dignified restraint. Others saw it as evasive. But while Hewitt was the most obvious figure in the public imagination, he was not the only man ever linked to Diana in this context. Over the years, a handful of other names had surfaced, men who had crossed paths with the princess during her unhappiest years. Some were friends, some colleagues in her charity work, and some simply the subjects of speculative tabloid stories built on the flimsiest of coincidences. One such figure was a polo player who moved in the same aristocratic circles as Diana and Charles. Another was a security officer who had reportedly grown close to her during overseas tours. Each of these men had, at one time or another, been subjected to the kind of public scrutiny that comes with being a possible other man in a royal narrative. Most denied any romantic involvement, and many went on to live relatively quiet lives, but the lingering association remained. The difficulty in identifying a definitive father in question lies not just in the secrecy of Diana's personal life, but in the nature of royal rumor itself. Once a story takes hold, particularly one as tantalizing as the idea that a prince might not be the king's son, it becomes nearly impossible to separate fact from fabrication. Every detail, from the shape of a nose to the inflection of a laugh, becomes fodder for armchair genealogy. Yet within the palace, the question of the father's identity was treated very differently. Those privy to the DNA results were less concerned with speculation and more with the implications. If the truth was ever to be formally acknowledged, would it include the identity of Harry's biological father, or would that detail remain unspoken? There were arguments for both approaches. Naming the father could provide closure, but it could also ignite a fresh wave of scandal, particularly if the man in question was still alive and unwilling to be thrust into the spotlight. For Harry, the situation was deeply personal. According to sources close to him, he had no interest in publicly naming his biological father, regardless of who it was. His reasoning, reportedly, was twofold. First, to protect the man's privacy, and second, to prevent the media from turning yet another figure in his life into a commodity. Harry was said to believe that whatever the public thought they were entitled to know, some truth should remain within the family. William, however, viewed the matter through the lens of public trust. In private discussions, he reportedly argued that partial truths had a way of looking like lies. If the results were ever made public without the full context, the media would fill in the blanks themselves, potentially causing more harm than good. He feared that endless speculation could destabilize the monarchy even further than a controlled release of the full story. The debate between these two perspectives mirrored the larger divide between the brothers on how to handle the DNA revelation. Harry leaned toward emotional truth and personal agency. William leaned toward strategic disclosure and institutional preservation. Neither position was entirely wrong, but they were fundamentally incompatible. Outside the palace, the search for answers became a media sport. Journalists dug through archives, revisited old photographs, and interviewed anyone who had been in Diana's orbit during the early 1980s. Former friends, staff members, and distant acquaintances found themselves fielding calls from reporters eager to piece together a definitive timeline. Some cooperated, offering anecdotes that either reinforced or undermined the prevailing theories. Others refused to speak, citing loyalty to Diana's memory. The fascination with identifying the father in question speaks to something larger than curiosity about one man's identity. It is about the allure of hidden truths, the idea that even the most scrutinized lives can hold secrets. In a world where so much about the royal family is stage-managed and polished, the possibility of an unvarnished reality is irresistible to the public. Whether the truth will ever be officially acknowledged remains uncertain. The palace, for now, maintains its silence. Harry continues to live his life on his own terms, unbound by the duties that once defined him. William presses forward with his role as heir, focusing on the responsibilities of the crown rather than the fractures in his family's past. But the question lingers, hanging in the air like an unfinished sentence. And as long as it remains unanswered, the speculation will never truly fade. For some, the identity of the father in question is a piece of history that deserves to be known. For others, it is a private matter that belongs only to those directly involved. For the monarchy, it is both a risk and a reminder, a testament to the fact that even the most carefully guarded legacies can be reshaped by a single truth. When the DNA results were first confirmed inside the palace walls, the discovery did not just disrupt the personal bonds between William and Harry. It set in motion a chain reaction of political maneuvering within the royal household. The monarchy is as much an institution of politics as it is of tradition, and in moments of crisis, it becomes a chessboard where every player, from senior courtiers to private secretaries, moves with calculated precision. The first group to react was the inner circle of King Charles. These were the senior aides, communications chiefs, and legal advisors whose loyalty lay with the reigning monarch above all else. For them, the revelation was less about Harry's personal identity and more about the potential damage to the crown's legitimacy. Acknowledging that one of the king's sons was not biologically his could invite constitutional questions, particularly among those who already questioned the monarchy's relevance. Even if Harry was no longer a working royal, the symbolism was potent and dangerous. Their priority was containment. In the days after the results came in, private meetings were held in the monarch's private study, attended only by the most trusted officials. Here, the options were laid out bluntly: suppress the information entirely and hope it never leaked, or find a way to release it on their own terms before someone else did. Suppression had obvious appeal. It would preserve the image of stability. But those in the communications department warned that in the digital age, nothing could be buried forever. A leaked document, a hacked email, even an off-the-record conversation with the wrong journalist could make the truth public without the palace having any control over the framing. On the other side of the chessboard were the courtiers aligned more closely with William. Though their primary loyalty was to the crown's future rather than its present, their considerations were no less strategic. William's advisors understood that his role as heir depended on projecting strength, unity, and moral authority. They were deeply aware that a revelation of this magnitude could be spun into a narrative of family dysfunction and mistrust. For them, the question was not whether the information should come out, but how to shield William from collateral damage when it did. Then there was the Harry factor. Though he had stepped away from royal duties, Harry still had connections to the machinery of the palace through people who had once served him loyally. Some of these individuals had drifted from the inner circle, but others remained in positions of influence, quietly feeding him updates. For the palace old guard, this was a dangerous vulnerability. If Harry decided to take the story public on his own, they would be left scrambling to respond. King Charles himself was caught between these competing forces. Publicly, he maintained his focus on his duties, continuing with scheduled engagements as though nothing had happened. Privately, those close to him say he was deeply unsettled. While Charles had long been aware of the rumors surrounding Harry's paternity, having them confirmed by science carried a different weight. His feelings toward Harry were complex, part paternal affection, part frustration, part disappointment at the choices his younger son had made. But even if the bloodline was not what tradition demanded, Charles had raised Harry as his own, and the thought of seeing his son publicly humiliated sat uneasily with him. Still, the king was a realist. He knew the monarchy's survival depended on public trust, and that meant acting strategically. He instructed his senior staff to prepare 2 contingency plans, one for a leak, one for an official statement. Each plan included detailed steps for media engagement, legal threats, and the careful release of archival photographs that reinforced the image of a close family. Behind the scenes, a subtler kind of power play was unfolding. Influential figures within the palace began reaching out to key allies in the press, feeling out their positions. Some editors, sensing the value of the story, hinted that they already had pieces in the works and were merely waiting for confirmation before publishing. Others were more cautious, aware that burning their relationship with the palace could cost them future exclusives. This delicate dance between the monarchy and the media had been going on for decades, but now the stakes were higher than ever. At the same time, Certain senior royals not directly involved in the matter began maneuvering to protect their own reputations. Princess Anne, for example, was said to have advised Charles that any official acknowledgement should focus on the positive, emphasizing the brothers' shared heritage through Diana, rather than dwelling on what divided them. Prince Edward, less politically active, reportedly urged for complete silence, arguing that the story would burn out if given no oxygen. In the communications wing, drafts of potential statements were written and rewritten. Each version walked a tightrope between candor and damage control. Some drafts leaned heavily on the language of family unity, painting the revelation as a private matter that did not alter the bonds between father and son. Others were more formal, acknowledging the scientific results but stressing their irrelevance to titles, succession, or the duties of the crown. The language was parsed down to the last syllable, with advisors debating whether the word paternity should even be used at all. Meanwhile, palace security protocols were quietly tightened. Access to certain archives and computer systems was restricted, and digital monitoring was increased to detect any unauthorized searches for documents related to the DNA tests. Even within the palace, whispers began about who could be trusted and who might be tempted to leak. Loyalty was a currency, and those who demonstrated it were rewarded with greater access, while those who didn't found themselves sidelined. The most intricate power play, however, came in the form of timing. The palace has long understood that when bad news must be released, the when is almost as important as the what. One proposal suggested waiting until a major international event, such as a royal wedding or a significant political summit, so that the revelation could be buried beneath bigger headlines. Another plan recommended dropping the story late on a Friday evening, a classic tactic designed to minimize coverage over the weekend. Through all of this, the brothers themselves became pawns in a larger game. William's schedule was quietly adjusted to keep him away from events where he might be asked questions on the subject. Harry, now living abroad, was shielded by distance but not by silence. Every public appearance carried the risk of an unexpected question from a reporter or a member of the public. The palace could control the narrative to some degree, but not the actions of two men who increasingly viewed each other with suspicion. One particularly tense meeting brought the factions together in the same room. Charles's senior aides, William's advisors, and a representative who still had Harry's ear. The goal was to find consensus on how to handle the situation. Instead, the meeting devolved into a battle of competing agendas. William's side accused Harry's of undermining the monarchy by pushing for transparency. Harry's representative countered that the institution was undermining itself by hiding the truth. Charles's aides tried to mediate, but the discussion ended without agreement, with each side retreating to their own camp. This stalemate was, in itself, a kind of resolution for the palace's power brokers. In a monarchy where image is everything, even inaction can be a strategy. By keeping the matter in limbo, they retained flexibility. If the story leaked, they could claim they had been preparing to address it. If it didn't, they could continue as though nothing had changed. But such a precarious balance could not last forever. The palace power plays of this period reveal a truth that has always existed beneath the surface of royal life. The crown is both a symbol and a battlefield. Every crisis, no matter how personal, is filtered through the lens of preservation. In the case of the DNA results, the preservation was not just of the monarchy's legitimacy, but of its control over the story. And in that battle, every word, every photograph, every carefully staged appearance was another move on the chessboard.